I'm going to talk a little bit about the modern forehand. And when you hear modern forehand, there's a few terms that are typically come along with that. You hear terms like open stance, windshield wiper, a kinetic chain, 2-foot pivot, a jumping 2-foot pivot. And in this video that I'm going to highlight, it is a bit dated, but
the power is built off of angular momentum, and what the students
this coach talks about angular momentum
from the ground up in that right leg
and open stance,
and then transfer that power up through the rotation of the hips and the shoulders. But it happens more spinning about an axis or rotating about an axis. And on this clip here, you can see I've drawn a long rectangular box.
So the
that
top
sort of shows how
the top box was his original forehand.
Through
the bottom,
traditional forehand, and on the modern forehand, it's more as if
the bottom is called the modern forehand.
Up and out of a barrel and spinning inside the barrel. So
now I'm going to back up just a little bit because
open stance, and then transfer that power up through the rotation of the hips and the shoulders.
Here's the slow motion. The problem with this, and many coaches still coach this, and I've seen a lot of college players play like this, using this jumping two-hand approach. But this is like version 1.0 of the modern forehand. The new modern forehand, the modern forehand 2.0, is much different than this. Although there are some of these concepts that still play, but the main issue with this is there's so much leg drive and this angular momentum as they speak. And it's very blurred, but the racket never releases. The racket's still lagging. And in the modern forehand, that is really the principle. It's more of an independent arm action. And the spin and power is really coming from the releasing of the forearm and wrist in a much more arm action with much less body jumping movement. So let's take a look at what I would consider some modern forehands. College player Petros Rissohos. So if you see this forehand here, this looks a little bit more like the forehand on the top, where he says this is the old forehand.
Rectangular box that sort of shows how the student moves
right?
from left to right through
Let's compare these two.
Traditional forehand, and
see the top?
The modern forehand, it's more.
So there is definitely some hip motion, there is some shoulder motion, but the racket head speed is from this elbow moving out on this 45-degree angle in a more independent motion. So if I step through this, you can see it's a semi-open stance, but not fully open stance. And that elbow moves out on that 45-degree angle. The racket lags, and then the racket releases, and you can see how the wrist goes more into a neutral position here. Let's take a look at some other. Look at Federer here. So same thing, you know, he's not jumping to hit this. What really is giving him this power is the deceleration of the shoulders, which is a little bit of a misnomer. If you follow the first video, they make it seem like you want to spin through the entire shot. I'm going to play this back in quarter speed here. And watch the shoulders decelerate. So the shoulders turn, and then they slam on brakes. Let's watch that again. Shoulders turn, and then they slam on brakes, and then the racket goes. So that is the loading and unloading. So you're loading when the shoulders go forward, and then the shoulders slam on brakes, and you unload. There's the load, start of the load, that's the load. Now the shoulders will slam on brakes and the racket will go. And that's the main difference in what I call the Modern Forehand 2.0. But there are many coaches out there that talk about things that are very confusing. This particular coach talks about how Federer pulls across the ball.
It doesn't go into the ball. They think about, they say step into the ball. They actually go across, pull this way, and you can see if you're filming from behind that their body has moved, a couple of feet to the left. Absolutely. Even Sampras did that, and most of the top players do. And that is very good also when you're running, because you get here and then you pull and you're covering the court a little bit more.
Now, what about Nadal?
So what I'm saying is virtually the opposite of what this coach is saying. I'm saying that the energy is actually going out this way on this 45-degree angle. Take a look at that again. An untrained eye might think that he's actually pulling across, but what is actually happening is as he goes forward on that 45-degree angle, he reaches his extension point, meaning that you can't reach any more on that 45. So once he reaches his full extension, the racket has to come back. He's not purposefully pulling the racket back. It's happening because he's throwing it out to the right. And you'll see the load and then the release. And this is because it's a lever. It's a hinged lever. It's not because he's actually pulling across. But you can also see he's not jumping, he's not in a full open stance, it's more of a semi-open stance. The key is that pushing out. See how the elbow goes out towards contact. Now let's take a look at another player here, Robin Haase. So he has this same technique. The elbow goes out. Slow this down. Elbow goes out, but he has a bent arm technique instead of a straight arm technique. And it seems like he's pulling across, but what happens is the elbow goes out on that 45, reaches its full extension, and then it has to come back. And that's where the racket head speed is happening. You notice he's not jumping, not spinning, semi-open stance, and getting a lot of racket head speed. It's all about the wrist loading and unloading.